your supporters to stay calm during this extended period, not to engage in any civil unrest? And will you pledge tonight that you will not declare victory until the election has been independently certified? President Trump, you go first.
I'm urging my supporters to go into the polls and watch very carefully, because that's what has to happen. I am urging them to do it. I am urging my people. I hope it's going to be a fair election. If it's a fair election, I am 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that.
President last night urging his supporters to go into the polls and watch very carefully. Jason Johnson, that's not an offhanded comment. Donald Trump Jr. cut an ad in which he called upon an army for Trump's election security operation. We need you to help us watch them. We need every able-bodied man and woman to join the army for Trump's election security. Calling on people like, oh, I don't know, the Proud Boys that President Trump gave license to last night to literally go to polling places and, quote, watch the election. Jason?
Oh, sorry. I'm good to hear. Yeah, here's the thing, Willie, and I think this is what I was saying before about terrorism. You have to look at the grand total of what the president is doing, right? Remember, he's still attacking the post office with DeJoy. We still have our postal workers fighting back. They're trying to suppress the vote that way. They're still suing counties across the country to try to end mail-in ballot applications and everything else like that. He has made it clear that he's going to get judges that are going to try and throw out as many ballots as possible. Then you can get to your local state suppression, and now he's added to it. I am calling, him and his son are calling on an army of terrorists to stop people from voting. That's what the President of the United States is doing. And I think this is so important for us to recognize, if this was Erdogan, if this was Boris Johnson, if this was Bolsonaro in Brazil, we would be screaming right now. We would say, oh, my gosh, this is what dictators do. That's exactly what the President of the United States is doing. And he has said, I've said for months, he's not running a re-election campaign. He's just trying to consolidate power. And I think what's important is we have to remember that part of this rhetoric is to intimidate people. Part of the rhetoric is to make people quit. The one thing that we have to be careful about from last night and the polling is, and just like Joe mentioned earlier, was really good. I went and looked at Frank Luntz and all of his data and all of his his focus group. The biggest danger is that you saw people last night in the focus group throw up their hands and say, I don't want to vote for either of these guys. Between that and violence and calling on terrorists, that is a success for Donald Trump. He wants us all to get in the mud with him, because if we get in the mud, we can't climb this democracy out of the ditch that he drove us into. So yeah, I'm not surprised that he's calling on an army. I'm not surprised that his son is calling on an army, and he will get more aggressive and more violent as we get closer to the election.
Well, and, you know, it has been the goal of America's enemies for decades to undermine American democracy. It has been the goal of Vladimir Putin specifically to undermine American democracy and Americans' faith in their own democracy. And last night, what we saw with Donald Trump was one candidate's attempt to undermine America's faith in democracy, to undermine Americans' faith in the democratic process, to intimidate voters from going out and participating in a process that so many American heroes have given their lives for, that right to choose leaders democratically, and even called upon white supremacists, anti-Semitics, to stand by. All ominous, and of course, all for the same purpose, along with that entire spectacle last night, as Frank Foer commented on last night. The goal is to undermine Americans' confidence in the American process and in this election, because he knows he's going to lose. So what does he want to do? He wants to undermine American democracy. And it's up to Americans to not let that happen. So, John Heilman, let's actually talk about something we haven't talked about today, because I agree with Masha Gessen that our political lexicon is limited in its ability to respond to the extremes and the excesses and the authoritarian instincts of Donald Trump. But we need to do it anyway, because there are millions and millions of people that are going to go out and vote. And I think it's safe to say, and I say this very calmly, I think what's going to happen is that people who saw that debate last night are just going to be even more pissed off. That's the word, to go out and vote against Donald Trump. And I speak specifically of women, suburban voters, more educated voters, independents, all the demographic groups that we have seen moving away from Donald Trump and the Republican Party, whether it was in the 2007 gubernatorial and legislative races, whether it was in the 2018 Democratic landslide, whether it was in the 2019 races in Kentucky and Louisiana, or whether it's been in some of these races in 2020. So I'm curious if what we're seeing now and what we saw with what Mitch McConnell did immediately following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we've seen a drop in polls because, again, suburban women, women in general, more educated voters and independents who are dead set against bringing on yet another Supreme Court justice before this election. I'm wondering if Donald Trump is just breaking up any remnants of support beyond his most hardened, boiled-down base.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, I think that's the other way in which you read what happened last night, right? Which is the decision first, as I said earlier in the hour, to try to break the system, break the process, right? That expression of I can't compete if I debate like a normal debater, if I accept the terms the way they are conventionally laid out, I can't win, right? That's one thing. The second thing, though, is like it's one thing to say, as we have for months now, that Donald Trump is going with the base-only strategy, that he's trying to animate his base, he's trying to find white non-college men, broadly speaking, in battleground states, and trying to identify ones who didn't vote in 2016 and bring them out in 2020 at the expense of trying to compete in the middle, kind of giving up on suburban, moderate, independent, Republican-leaning, suburban, college-educated white women, for example, right? He's not going to focus on them. This was a performance last night that was not about not focusing on them. This was a performance last night that was designed in some ways, kind of expressly. It's the only way to kind of get your head around it. He was basically not just not targeting that group of voters, but basically writing them off entirely. There's no other way to interpret that performance other than to say it was, again, an act of kind of direct hostility. The things that
again, to what end, though, John? John, to what end? Well, because, of course, he can't win without those suburban voters, without the women, without the independents. So if he's writing them off, he's writing off the election. And I agree with you. That's what he did. So to what end is he basically writing off the election and his ability to win in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, even in Florida?
I think he is doing, I think you have to combine this part of the analysis with what Jim was talking about before the break, which is that their strategy now is very clear, which is to try to win in enough battleground states the election day vote. And that, I think, is what's going on here. It's like Donald Trump is trying to say, how do I get people, a group of people who are largely not immune from concern about coronavirus. You know, we already know there's a disparity between Republicans and Democrats in terms of who's willing to put health concerns aside and show up on election day, stand in a long line, go and vote in person. We know there's this giant disparity. Democrats are going to vote early and by mail. Republicans are going to show up on election day. Trump is now speaking to, those Republican-leaning suburban women act more like Democrats in this context, right? Trump is focused explicitly on how do I win the game day vote? How do I get my core base supporters to come out on election day so that on the game day vote, I can put a flag in the ground and say, I won Pennsylvania on election day in-person voting. And then after election day, all of those other votes, those tens of millions of votes that come in by mail, that have come in early, that many of which are not going to be counted until after election day, then engage in a knife fight in the counting rooms, in the validation certification process, in the courts, in the Electoral College, in the House of Representatives, ultimately. Again, Meacham and Jim Vandehei are talking about this the right way now. The Trump campaign thinks the fight for the presidency is not. We all say, hey, election day is early. People are voting early right now. They're saying we don't care about that. We're going to contend that all of that was illegitimate. And for us, election day starts on election day and continues until January 20th. That's where the fight is going to happen. And that's why Trump is now starting to talk about all of these, trying to get what's the Proud Boys thing about? It's about their increasing conviction that there is going to be civil unrest in the country between, I talk about their conviction. This is not a left-wing partisan conspiracy theory. Within Trump's inner circle, within Trump's councils of power, within the influential people on the outside like Steve Bannon, they now talk about the war starts the day after Election Day. The fight is between November 4th and January 20th, and some of that fight is going to be, as I said, in the counting rooms, in the courts, in the House of Representatives, and potentially in the streets. And I think they are getting ready for that fight. And they are, in some respects, realizing it's the only path to the presidency for him. And it's going to be really ugly. That's when Trump said last night, this is not going to be pretty. This is going to be ugly. That's what he's talking about, Joe.
Yep, he is. John Hellman, thank you very, very much. We have much more on that scary scenario in just a moment. Bob Woodward will be our guest. But first, fact-checking seems a little quaint after what we saw from the president last night. Should have been fact-checking in real time last night. But Steve Ratner has some on the economic claims that were made. Donald Trump said we're in a V-shaped economic recovery, that the virus interrupted the best economy ever, that he saved the manufacturing sector, and that the economy will crash if Biden gets elected. Steve, take us through your charts, and was the president saying the truth?
Thanks, Mika. And those are the four subjects on the economy that we do want to cover today. So let's start with this whole idea of a V-shaped recovery, which we've heard a lot about in the past. And we heard a little bit about it last night in the midst of all of the yelling and screaming that you've all been talking about now. So sad to watch all that happen. But you can see on this chart the enormous drop that the economy suffered in the second quarter, 22 million jobs lost through April thanks to the pandemic. But you don't see a V. You don't see it coming back up the other side. What you see is 2.7 million jobs, 4.8, and so forth. But the pace of the recovery has been slowing. In August, it was 1.4 million jobs. This Friday, we'll get another number. It will probably be under 1 million. And all in all, we've only recovered about half of the jobs we've lost. And the same is true of the overall economy. Only about half of the loss of the size of the GDP will be recovered this year. So that's the story on the so-called V-shaped recovery. Now let's talk about his claim that even before the virus, he had the best economy ever. So this chart goes all the way back to the days of Eisenhower and shows the GDP growth under each of those presidents. And you can see that, in fact, Donald Trump's economy was far from the best ever. In fact, it was only the 8th out of the 11 last economies. And that's not even counting the virus. That is before the virus. And many of these other presidents had recessions, they had challenges, and so forth. If you add in the effects of the virus, what you would find is that Donald Trump's economy was, in fact, the worst of all 11 of these past presidents. He mentioned manufacturing last night. And he has talked a lot about manufacturing during his time in office. And it is true that when he first came in and passed those tax cuts, and you heard about those tax cuts last night, of which 85% of the benefit went to wealthy people and to business, it did help manufacturing in the short run. But then he got into a tariff war. And the tariff war actually drove down our growth in manufacturing jobs. In fact, again, even before the pandemic, you can see that by the end of the fourth quarter of 2019, we were, in fact, adding no manufacturing jobs whatsoever. And since the virus hit, we've, in fact, started to lose manufacturing jobs, a total of 734,000 so far this year. And then to the last question, Mika, on the question of who would help the economy more. This chart that we're going to put up now is from Moody's. It is a nonpartisan, impartial service. And what it says is basically that Biden, in fact, would help the economy more. Biden, with a split Congress between Democrats and Republicans, would be 3.5% GDP growth. Trump, with a split conference, would only be 3.2. A Democratic sweep would actually lead to 4.2% growth in the economy versus only 3.1% under the Republicans. And this is because if the Democrats get in office, as you heard the vice president say last night, he has a package of plans. He has robust plans to address all of our problems, unlike the president, who you heard last night really didn't articulate anything of a second-term agenda. So here you have an independent economist, Moody's, saying, in fact, contrary to perhaps some people's guesses, that a Biden presidency would be better for the economy than a second term of Donald Trump, Mika.
So, Steve, these are remarkable charts, and I'd love to go back to the Trump economy compared to the other presidents. Really quickly, just to underline this one more time, not so much for Donald Trump, because he knows he's lying about it, but for news people that over the past 4 years have taken Donald Trump's bluster as reality, when in fact, even before the pandemic, Donald Trump and his economy grew more slowly than Eisenhower's, than JFK's, than LBJ's, than Nixon's, grew slower than Jimmy Carter's economy, and of course grew slower than Ronald Reagan's economy. So if you take all of the post-war presidents, save Truman, Donald Trump is 7th out of 11. That is not even close to the best economy ever. It's, in fact, one of the worst since World War II.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Joe. And in fact, a fact that came out last night in the debate that I've used in other charts with you guys is in the last 3 years of Obama's presidency, the Obama-Biden administration created more jobs in its last 3 years than Donald Trump created in his first 3 years. So the idea that he's the greatest jobs creator in history is also not true. And as you point out, all of these other presidents, they faced their economic challenges. They faced stagflation. They faced recessions. They faced wars. They faced plenty of other issues. And yet Donald Trump has one of the worst economic records of any president since World War II.
Well, and that's why our lower third shouldn't say Trump economy was not the best ever. If we're going to be more accurate, it would actually be Trump has one of the worst economies in the post-war era. Steve Ratner, thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.
We appreciate you getting the facts to us.
Let's bring in more important voices to this conversation this morning. MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, White House reporter for the Associated Press Jonathan Lemire, Washington anchor for BBC World News America and co-host of the new podcast, When Caddy Met Carlos, Caddy K.